All right, we got 4 people. I love this lecture. This is a good one. Hello, everybody. I'm going to give everybody a second. 1, how's it going? 2 / should have been 1. I hope everybody had a good weekend. Not really much for housekeeping this week. I will work on grading in the next week or so. This is my big week of deadlines for the whole semester. So I have 3 big projects. You know this. You have this too. So I have I'm getting those taken care of, and then I'll be able to take care of some stuff in regards to grading. But as for GB Studio, folks, any questions? Anything? I see some folks getting into the habit of getting used to being into the documentation and things like that, which is good. You want to get used to looking at the documentation to see how to see all the steps you have to take, which is good. You're going to do that forever, which is part of what we want you to do. Is rely on those resources, because they're both good, but they're also it's a professional behavior thing. But I see people relying on that a lot, which is excellent. I don't know. Get started. So I'm just going to get started, and then if people filter in, that's great. If they don't, well, too bad. So today what we're going to talk about is hello. You were able to fix the issue with GB Studio. Yeah, again, I've never seen an issue. I've downloaded multiple versions of this engine, and I've never really had a bad download of it. The engine is pretty rock solid, and even in beta, it's very nice. I haven't even ever have it crash on me. So that's kind of great. That's a real red letter thing for a game engine, let me tell you. But yeah, do the thing, stick with it. All right. So let's get into some level design. If you're unfamiliar with my history with level design, by the way, this is probably going to take us to the first edition, but internet, what do you do? Oh, here we go. Okay, cool. Second edition, there we go. So if you don't know this, I actually I'm really just trying to look for a picture of the book. Let's do an image. Okay, there. Haha. So if you don't know, I publish a book on level design. I am a level designer. My background is in architecture. I was not an architect because I did not go and take my licensing exam, but I have a master's degree in architecture, and that is what my background is educationally. And so I've done level design in games, and a bunch of games, and indie and all sorts of stuff. And I wrote this book called An Architectural Approach to Level Design, which people seem to like a whole bunch. But it's it's it takes architectural theory and applies it to the act of level design. So it's not just like level design, learning how to use the Unreal Engine or something like that, which is a lot of people say like they really like that about it. Is I'm not just they always end up a lot of level design teachers complain about like, oh well, we just end up teaching Unreal, but we want to do something more with it than that. So people have been very, very kind about that work. But that gives you a background of like, my level of involvement with level design. This isn't just theorizing. This is like you're kind of getting it straight from the horse's mouth. I've done a ton of level design. I continue to do a ton of level design. And I've beyond just the book, I've published a bunch of articles. So, I want you to know where this is all coming from. And we actually have 2 lectures in this course, which is why I felt pretty good about pushing this one up. I might make this a permanent change. To talk about the basics of level design. Now, why do I want to talk to you about these basics? Oops. Let me move this here so that I can open another PowerPoint. So why do I want to give you this lecture now? Well, the reason for this is that you're doing a type of design right now in this class that the assignment is based on storytelling, but the execution is in a game style that heavily involves, space. So, you're going to want to control things like amount of backtracking and, pacing and how, different elements of your game all fit together. So, the idea is that you're not just putting story events in. You should like figure out how these story events should be, put together in a way that like the game is satisfying and it has a good pace to it. It's not like just clustered together and seems like everything moves too fast, but it's also not like drawn out and oh no, I have to trudge back across town again or something like that. You're designing and you're laying out your stuff really in a nice way. So we're going to talk about some level design basics today. I might grab some information from another PowerPoint. We'll see. That might help you. If not from a PowerPoint, at least an article, and I'll explain it. Because it's relevant to your thing in particular. But let's get going on this. So first of all, what is level design? And this is actually like a really tough problem for a lot of game designers, especially young game designers. Young game designers tend to mix up level design with a bunch of other things. And so we need to first talk about like what level design is so that you don't screw this up. So for example, is level design making nice environment pictures? Is it putting a crap ton of enemies into a space and being like, good luck to your players? Well, let's look at some definitions of level design. So Jay Wilbur from Epic Games says that level design is where the rubber hits the road. Very kind of, you might be thinking it's very vague, but it's actually very meaningful, and I'll tell you why. Because it's clarified a little bit by John Romero, who, I'm not going to wait for the delay to do its thing, so I'll just tell you he worked on Doom. But he says the level designer is largely responsible for the implementation of gameplay in a title. That's a little more clear. But what do these two mean and what do they have in common? I guess before we move on. Now I will do my Q&A-ish part. Yeah, what do you think of those? Like, what do you think of when you think of level design? What is level design to you, dear students? I wish I had my son. My son has a. We got my son a plushie cacodemon. I wish I had it with me right now. It'd be very appropriate for this slide. Okay, so somebody says, level designers decide what players can see and what paths they can take. Oh, that's kind of cool. I like that. I think it allows for either experimentation or perfection of gameplay, but can be further emphasized by the environment design, or it can be hand in hand. I'm not fully sure. Okay, so, starting to allude to the connections between environment, like environment art design. I'm going to take environment design to be environment art. But be careful with that term design, because design and art are two different things. Like, again, you don't want to make the mistake ever of, being like, when somebody's doing art and just creating assets, saying that that's design. Because, you can design pieces of art, but when you are producing art assets, it's very different than like design in this context. I guess when I think of level design, I think about the missions you have to complete and move on to the next stages of the game. Okay, so now you're getting into some specifics too, which is good, which is like missions, which does not apply to all games, but that's important because for a long time, level design was talked about as this thing that you couldn't really talk about, or you couldn't really at least write about or teach very well, because it was something that changed based on which game you were making at the time. So basically the thought process was like, well, how can we teach level design when it changes per game? So we have to figure out like what are some like universal elements of these, so that there can be like a unifying theory of level design. So my definition, which is a little bit academic, but I like to say that level design is the thoughtful execution of gameplay into game space for players to dwell in. Now, you've each touched on some elements of this a bit. So first of all, think about like that experimentation or perfection of gameplay. So first of all, the level space, whatever it might be, and level space can be the layout of a match 3 puzzle. It can be, a Sokoban board. It can be a immersive 3D environment. It can be 2D. And by the way, if anybody is thinking that 2D is not level design, you're wrong. You're just wrong. A lot of like what modern level designers do is 3D. That's because like if you're working in a big studio, you're probably making 3D games. But what do you think you do when you make a 2D game? Like, what do you think you'd call that? So level design can be 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional, but the idea is that you're taking gameplay mechanics of the game and you're translating, you're designing, and when I say design, remember, context for a user, context for objects to interact in, you know, and like, wait, no. Where a designer creates a context for player or for users to interact with. From which meaning, no, that's system, but still meaning emerges from environments or from design too. But the idea is that, like, as designers, we're creating like places for experiences to happen. So we take gameplay and we make like some screen or space or interactive thing that players look at and will, you know, it'll direct their movement through the gameplay in meaningful ways. Now, I use the word dwell, and for an architect type person, that's a very loaded word because dwelling revolves around, like, you know, you don't just like crash in an apartment or something. You know, you this isn't like, you know, oh, I'm going to go back to the apartment and just like sleep there. It's the idea of like the totality of the lived experience happens in this space. So in our levels, we are trying to take into account the totality of the game player's experience of our space, which starts to talk about like a lot of stuff that you know, we talked about situational game design. We start to talk about like the up moments and the down moments, all the times when you just kind of like stop and think and reflect, the fast parts of games and the slow parts of games. All of this has to take place in the level, and we have to account for it. Another way to think about level design is like the primary means of communicating with a player. So, you know, when we are designing our levels, you know, this is like, as a game designer, this is the space that the player is going to see. This is what you call the front end. So on a normal piece of software like PowerPoint, not that you can see what my screen has on it, but PowerPoint, YouTube, OBS, other stuff, you know, like the interfaces, that's called user experience design, is like, you know, that's the front end. That's the thing that we, the users, interact with. This is why, you know, I always tell you, like, you know, hey, it's not just about software, because we're just end users, right, of the software. We're just getting kind of like, we're just the customer of that. So, you know, but where this becomes special, it's not thinking about, like, again, us using Unreal. It's thinking about us using Unreal to create a front end, a level, a world, a series of scenes that deliver like interesting things to our players and create that conversation between us and the people who are playing our games. So again, when you're thinking about like level design, you know, a lot of students think that level design looks like this, like that they should be looking at the level editing tutorials. But let me tell you a few things. So one of the things that I want to first of all make very clear, and again, the first thing you have to do as a teacher when you teach level design is kind of like lay it out in terms of what is what. Okay, so we started talking about like environment art and level design. So let me hit you with this one. Environment art is the last thing to go in level design. And this is really important because, you know, basically, like, I also teach capstone. And what I don't want to see in capstone when you get there is any of the game developers to be like, all right, I'm making my level prototype, and then you start putting in all the nice artwork. Because what happens is you're going to goof. You're going to make a bad level. It's okay. We all do. Because you don't know if your game is good until you test it a bunch, right? We know this because we're in prototyping. And what we want to do is figure out, like, how do we make the best thing possible? So what we do in level design is a process called gray boxing. So level design is all about spatial experience. And to do that, we have to take the most basic, big, chunky geometry and build it out into what we used to call an architecture partie, which means like just kind of the most basic formal shape without any of the details. So why do we do that? Well, if we're making a level, we want to understand in a broad sense that our level works, that we want to understand that like it's fun, that it's engaging, that the player is rewarded by playing it, that it doesn't move, like I said, too fast, too slow. We want to make sure that it's easily navigable and the player doesn't get lost. We want to make sure, above all, the player thinks that the level is fair. I actually saw this one really, I think it was from Dave Perry. I have to go look it up. It's in a book over there. But there was a quote that I saw about level design, or about not game design in general, but I think it really applies to level design a whole lot, which is that game design is about blame. That's kind of it. That struck me as really interesting, because what the designer was saying, I think it was Dave Perry, I can't remember, is that game design is about getting the player to blame themselves for screwing up and failing when they fail. Because what you don't want... Well, I mean, here's the question. What don't you want? Who do you want them not to blame? So if we want them to blame themselves, who are we trying to get them not to blame when they play our games? So who do we want the player to blame when something goes wrong when they're playing the game? Did not mean to rhyme that one. Anybody? Anybody? I really hate this lag. I really hate this. Their luck is that's a good guess. That's a good guess because, like, yeah, you kinda, maybe. But, like, do you want luck to be involved? I mean, that gets into something else because, in a broader game design sense, like, doesn't it suck when games are just based on luck? Like, I think, at least by modern game design standards, if luck is too much a part of games, then it feels arbitrary. So like in D&D, there's the luck of the actual like die rolling, but you get to do a bunch of other stuff before you roll the die. Whereas like Candyland, it's all luck. It's all like the cards. So who do they want to blame? So maybe not luck, but what else? What else can they blame? What else can they blame? Me! Yes! If by extension, you, the player, yes! You blame yourself. You want to be like, oh man, I was stupid. Or, oh man, I'm just not good enough yet. But one more time. but I'm going to try one more time. Or next time I'm going to be better. Because that's why you want them to blame themselves, because they can say to themselves, next time I'll do better, next time I'll do this, next time I'll try harder, instead of, and this goes into the luck thing, stupid game! You don't want that. Stupid designer, gonna go make angry, belligerent comments on the internet and be toxic and be mean on Reddit. You know, that's what you don't want. You want to be to get along with your game players. That's not to say that like toxic people on the internet aren't just going to exist. They will. They do. But that beside, that to the side, like you want to make a game that the player, if they fail, they blame themselves, and if they win, they're rewarded and they're like, oh man, this level's cool. So we gray box again and again. We make sure that our game is such that like, now that's not to say all the boxes are gray. If you look at, let me make sure. Okay. If you look at this, the blue water is still blue. The green vegetation is still green. If you look at this, the giant's gold ring is gold. The red stone is red. So there's visual indicators in the color. It's not all gray, but the idea is that you build this out of big blocky geometry, and then you try out the gameplay. You watch some people play. You make sure that it's easy to navigate, easy to use, that any challenges aren't unfair, things like that. And then once you get this, once you have your level refined to, what you're basically doing is like, if you see something you need to change, you can easily change it when it's just in big, chunky BSP brushes. Instead of when it's like, oh, shoot, okay, I got to take out all these individual little environment tiles. Think about having to do that every time your level doesn't work right. So, you want to be like, oh, this hallway should be over here. Click, click, click. Brr, instead of, oh, this hallway should be over here. Click 157 times. On 158 you'll click the wrong thing, and then your selection goes poof, and then you're, damn it, 1, 2, 3. You get what I'm getting at? This is why we prototype. So we know our game is good in broad strokes before we get down to the nitty gritty. We do the same thing in level design, and that's why level design does have a barrier between it and the environment art that is necessary. And this is also why level designers think about like spatial usability theory, like professional level designers, whatever tools. But they want to know about spatial usability theory. And I actually have data to back this up, because I am teaching a GDC level design masterclass later this week, and I did a pre-masterclass poll of my I struggle to call them students because they're like colleagues, but also students, I guess, because they signed up for the class. I don't know. But a bunch of them indicated they were like, no, this is what I want. So that's what they're looking for is, level designers want to think about, how do I reach my players? So this is where I'm going to pop in. So I should go update this slide deck, because, let's do that now. Let's see what happens when I update a slide deck when I'm in the middle of showing it. Boop, 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 boop. So we're going to go here, and then we're going to go do this, and then we're going to boop. And then we're going to see if it blows up. Alright, so it's probably going to catch up. I want to make sure it's catching up. I'm not seeing my video, but if you are, okay, cool. So, trying to see how. Wow, there is a long lag here. Anyway, so let me get back on mental track. So when we look at spatial theory, a good way to think about, so in architecture there is this theory, and it's not something that we like that you would use when you are in an office all the time. I had to explain this to a friend in the industry because he's like, hey, yeah, architecture theory, I don't use it all the time. How am I supposed to use this? And I'm like, why are you trying to use this every day? This is a nice visual aid to explain things to newcomers. So this is what I'm using it for. So this is not something that's going to this isn't a silver bullet of level design by any means, but this is good to understand what I'm getting at here. So in architecture, there's this thing called the Vitruvian Triad that was created by the Roman architect Vitruvius, who was alive during the 1st century BCE. And he said that buildings must have 3 things, again, in very broad strokes. He said it must have firmitas, or firmness, so structural, and it basically has to stand up. Utilitas, or commodity. It has to have usefulness. It has to be useful and serve a purpose. But then it should also have venistas, which is delight, which is aesthetic beauty and enjoyment and artistry. Well, what the heck does this have to do with us? So let's talk about level design. Level design, when you think about level design, I want you to think about a high level goal. And again, this isn't, somebody's not in the office going to be like, yeah, can you get more venistas in here? But think about these things. First of all, when you make a level, it should work. It should function. It should be without glitches. You should QA test and bug fix and make sure all the colliders are nice and all the, there's nothing where the level blocks you out unless it is you are not meant to go back. But I was listening to a podcast yesterday about a gaming podcast, and they were talking about, well, there's this collection mechanic in this one game, but past a certain point in the game, you can never go back, so it kind of breaks the collection mechanic because you cannot complete the collection if you go to this place too early or something like that. You want to avoid stuff like that. So it should work. It should be functional. But also, what a lot of people don't think about is that it should be usable. It should be navigable by the player. So the player should never feel like they are lost. And what makes a player feel... Here's a question. So if you've ever felt lost in a level, what happened? Why were you lost? What were the elements of your confusion, or the causes of your confusion? Can you think back to them? So what were some of the causes of your confusion? Sorry, I'm less than 24 hours before Kickstarter goes. So we're, got some new followers. It's like all hands on deck. So like, what were some of the elements of your confusion in the levels you played? How'd you get lost? How'd you get confused? What? I mean, and I guess if you don't know why, well, there's a problem. Not with you, but with the level. But, you know, name a game where you thought, or a level in a game where you thought it was confusing, or hard to navigate, or hard to use. Yeah, so a classic one. Everything looked the same. Couldn't find my way forward. So there's no landmarking. I think of a lot of times I got lost in games. I had to step away from the game for the longest time, and I came back to it. Okay, so bad like onboarding or updating. That's kind of interesting. I actually not a lot of games do a great job at getting you back on track if you stepped away a long while ago. But what was I was playing Dragon Quest XI, and it does a really good job of giving you the sort of last time, our heroes ... update. And it was great. It was absolutely wonderful, because I'm like, oh, I remember that now. As opposed to if I were to step back into Horizon Zero Dawn, and I love that game, but that's a game that I kind of come and go from, and every time I come and go from it, I'm like Gandalf, I have no memory of this place. It wasn't clear what I was supposed to do next, making it frustrating to play. Yeah, so if there's no indicator of any sort that and no point of interest, that's the other thing that you might not realize is happening, but if there's no point of interest to be well, there's a tower, I guess I can go to the tower, if there's nothing drawing you, it ceases to be usable. And then the last thing you want is delight. It must elicit a reaction from the player. This is the meaning that we've been talking about. So, what does the level design process look like? First one, planning. Now, so often, new designers want to just get going. Open up. I got to design a level. Okay, open up Unity. Load up Pro Builder. All right, let's roll. Don't do that. Level design starts happening well before you hit the engine. Level design starts in documentation, which I'm not even really showing you right here, but level design is a lot of let me see how long it takes to open this page. I did log in. Oh. Level design is a lot of documenting stuff, right? It's sitting down and being well, here's our idea for a level. Here's a summary of what the level is, and there's no one way to write this. It's up to you and your studio and what works well. But you say okay, here's where you are in the story. Here's some concept art. Here's some pictures, and what are your design what do you want to happen in the level? What are your goals for the level? That's the kind of thing that you want to exist. You want to have all this stuff laid out in a nice way. You don't want to just be again, oh, forest, okay, landscape tool, click the trees, select the kind of tree, flail my mouse on the, click down and flail my mouse. Okay, forest. You want to think about well, okay, we want to introduce a new character. We want to have maybe more difficult than the first stage. It's the second stage. We want it to feel mysterious and eerie and kind of cool. And maybe in this case, because we're working on a game that has a set of, it's based on intellectual property, We're gonna, you know, have like it based on specific scenes with their own character to them. So, you know, and then we have like, then you mark down like, okay, what assets are we going to use? What art details are we going to use? What characters are going to be in it? You start to like think about, oh, I got to design that guy. I got to design both these guys. You think about like, you know, what is actually going to be in the level. You start to list it out. So that's really helpful. Like level design can be that. It can be just like listing out the level ideas, but sitting down to do that. I can't remember if I said it to this class. I know I said it to the capstone students last week, but you know, months of programming can save you hours of planning is an old saying. And what that means is that like if it sounds backwards, it is, because what it's trying to say is like if you don't plan, you're going to end up doing months of extra work. So, you know, sitting down and being like, well, here's who's in my level, here's what the level's about, here's what it's trying to do. And then, you know, if you do have environment art going, like you can start to say, you know, here's what assets are going to be in there. What I showed you was a living document, meaning that it was very short, and then we made environment art assets, and then we started, and enemies, and we started like listing who is all going to be in there. So, you know, these are things you're always going to be adding to, but that planning is super important, and that writing it down is super important, because again, like I literally just sat down and was like, oh yeah, I got to put that guy in. Oops. So, you know, step 1, plan. Step 2, start to think about, you know, those situations you want to put the player in. You want to think about, you know, mapping out the player's like mental journey. So there's a thing called a gameplay narrative, where it is like, I want the player to see this, and I want the player to see this, and I want the player to experience that. Excuse me. It's like you're writing out the story of somebody playing your level. That can be very important. So right now, like, you know, here's a flowchart. This is another way of mapping out a level. So maybe it's not a full level narrative, but you say like, okay, well, what are we going to have the player do? Maybe they'll encounter a locked door. And what is the sequence? Yes, planning is a term used out there. And again, remember, like, I'm not just, you know, I'm speaking as somebody who has designed levels professionally. I have to remember what every studio has different names for different documents. Every studio has different names for different documents. I even just like sent a guy I'm working with on Nemo a message, because he used a term yesterday during our meeting of a kind of document he wanted to demonstrate, and I'd not heard it used called that before. So I can share that with you if he replies. But yeah, you know, level designers plan. Like I was once in a game jam with a guy who's worked at a bunch of AAA, and he's like, yeah, I'll do some level design. And he just wrote a document, and then we built it. You know, because he was like a producer type person. But yeah, like level planning is a thing you do. It's not just about hopping into an engine. Like, you should never just hop into an engine. I hope you've learned that by now. So, other things you can do then is, so you can map out your level. Like, you can start to think about the like decision making of the level. Like, here's a flow chart. You can have a, like, you know, you can start to map out like the flow chart of your level. Does the player have a key? You know, what does this do? Ideally, like something like this actually helps you program the level, because then you have like logic. You know, you have yes, no, if, then statements going. Other things you can do to start planning out your level. This is all even on paper beforehand. But you can start thinking about like how spaces are going to work in very general terms in your level. This is called a bubble diagram. And what you do with these, or molecule diagram rather, what you do with a molecule diagram is you build this thing. Basically you like make circles, and those circles are your major spaces in your level. And then you draw arrows or marks in between them that imply some sort of relationship. So here we have what's going on in this level, a jailbreak. Get out of prison, then infiltrate the base. Okay, cool. So we have a major start and major exit. And then there's like these smaller areas, jump down 2 path, cross bridge. Okay, so it's a short level. Maybe it's at the beginning of our story or something like that. We can start, and then there's this big dashed line. Well, what does that imply? Well, it's kind of up to you, but I mean it to mean that you start and you unlock the gate, and then maybe you can see the cliff base in the distance. So this is a really nice way to can be very nice to, like, if you're going to give the player a goal, telegraph the goal to them so they have some idea where to go. I mentioned like a tower beforehand. That's level designers call that a weenie, and the term is derived from Walt Disney. He used the term architectural weenie when talking about the design of Disneyland. And what this means is that some big object that draws the occupant's eye and gets them to go to that thing. So if you've ever been to Disneyland or Disney World, there's a giant castle in the middle of both of the Magic Kingdom and Disney World, or just Disneyland. But there's a giant castle in the middle of those. That giant castle is supposed to make you want to go to the giant castle. And then each, like Tomorrowland and all those other places, they each have their own big architectural weenie. Architects call this a landmark, but basically the idea is that, again, it's a big thing to go towards. So in video games, think in any Ubisoft game, like a Far Cry type game, they're going to have a big tower, and you're going to go to the tower, and you're going to climb the tower, and then you're going to get a sense of what's around you. Even in Spider-Man, where the city was based on, and I'm not even doing this from my own analysis, this is from the developer, in his GDC talk about it. Or not like it was one developer, but like one of the level designers. They would make the most important buildings the tallest buildings, and then other shorter buildings around them, would kind of like work up to that building. So a big tall building would be surrounded by shorter buildings, which then would be surrounded by shorter buildings than that, and so on. Having some sort of like call out and visual marker that you can see from when you're setting your like goals, like, oh, that's where I'm supposed to end up, is really positive. Then this arrow right here implies it's one way, so I'm going to jump down to here, what's going to be there, and then I'm going to cross a bridge. And then, so see, this is kind of direct and linear. But, that's not to say that we're going to just make like literally that shape. We can make something that looks like this. Okay, I get out, hop, and then I kind of like sneak around. Maybe there's a choice of how to sneak around, when I get to the base, so it's a little more like Metal Gear Solid and I have decisions to make. But, this is just a planning document. This is where you say, like, this is how I want the spaces to have relationships with each other, but that's not necessarily going to become the map, okay? This is not mapping. This is just saying, like, in very general terms, when you start the level, I want you to be able to see. I want there to be a one-way thing so that you have to, like, there's a drop-off point or something like that. This is you mapping out spatial relationships and experiences, and then you turn that into level geometry through your gray boxing and testing. Any questions on that? Any questions on that planning stuff? So here's a question. How do you decide what goes in a level? It can be based on a lot of factors. First of all, you want to think about what point of the game the level is. And, first, you have to think about, like, what are your core mechanisms? What are your core mechanics? So, are you making Super Meat Boy? Are you making Legend of Zelda? Are you making, whatever? And I'm not saying you are literally making those. I'm saying, like, what are your mechanics? So what's your game about? What are you doing while you play? Next, you want to figure out, what level is this? And what I mean by that is, like, what order is the set of levels? So let me bring up that Little Nemo thing again. So, for example, like, we have level design here as this document. So we have, like, level 1. Well, this isn't technically level 1. Nemo's house is, like, our hub level. The first level is going to be, like, the night sky. And we're going to design that last because you want to typically design first levels last. Because the first level's job is to teach you how to play the game. And the thing that you don't want to do is design the level before you know what your player needs to know about playing the game. And if that sounds very confusing, let me explain. When you design a game, you're going to design a level. And you're going to design just like a sample level. And that level is going to be what we call a vertical slice. Meaning it is like, here is, in my game, it's a sample. It's maybe a level or two. It's like some representative chunk that looks like the game is going to look like when it's done. It's typically what you make. That level is probably 3 or 4. And the reason for that is that when you make that slice, you don't want to hold back. You kind of want to show, both because you're going to be, like, making your mechanisms, making your abilities, learning how to do cool things with your level design. You're probably going to, go all out a little bit. And that's okay. But what's going to happen is that, if you were to take that to a show, it's a good demo piece, but, like, somebody might need a little bit of an onboarding. You might need to, like, help somebody out a little bit playing the level. But that can be helpful because what you then learn is, like, oh, well, we thought that mechanic was going to be hard for the player to learn, but that's easy. They need help with this other mechanic. So then what you do is after you've made some stuff, then you start saying, like, well, in this level we're going to introduce this, and in that level we're going to introduce that. And then you start to figure out, like, what the level's going to be about based on, like, where you think new mechanics will be interesting. And then you kind of work backwards and you say, okay, now we know what we need to teach. Typically the way you think about levels is that you never want to do kitchen sink. And I realize I just said, like, you kind of go all out, but you do also never want to use, like, go full kitchen sink until maybe, like, the last level when it's a final exam sort of thing. Levels should be about 1 or 2 things. And the reason they should be about 1 or 2 things is that you don't want to confuse the player, and I need to wrap this up in a second so that we can move on, but, like, I would definitely go check out Mark Brown's video about, what was it? Well, there's 2 videos. Mario's 4-step level design and Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. And they're both side-scrolling platformers, but, like, you'll get a sense of how level, like, broad strokes level design works, where basically what you're going to do is you're going to take, like, 1 or 2 mechanics and you're going to make the level about that mechanic. And you're going to, like, really juice the mechanic in the level. So, like, you're going to have beginning of level, basic version of the mechanic, and then you ramp it up a little bit. Maybe you have to do the mechanic, but the challenges are harder, or there's more enemies, or there's more spikes or lava or whatever. And then you twist the mechanic, and then you kind of do a final exam on the mechanic. in Donkey Kong Country, what they do is they'll take like two mechanics and then start like smushing them together in interesting ways. But you want to make generally levels about one or two things, and then again, you want to figure out like where that fits. Is this an advanced mechanic, an intermediate mechanic? So that's where you say like, oh, this is world 2 or world 3 or world 1. There's a lot of factors. It takes a lot of nuance and a lot of practice, as you can probably guess, to get this right. But you learn to ramp up over time. So I hope that helps. I realize that that's a lot, and it's not necessarily like an objective answer, but there isn't really an objective answer. It's design. How detailed would you say these flowcharts or diagrams are when working on the initial planning? So if we go back to this, not very. It's none of these are. First of all, here's another thing that I've noticed students want that forget about. No prototype and no chart, no planning piece is going to be one and done. There's no all-in-one thing. So like, I'm sure you've noticed, Twine has limitations. I'm sure you're noticing that, and I know you're like, oh yeah, I hate the color palette. I'm not talking about that. I'm sure you're noticing that GB Studio has limitations. Yes, but the idea is that you can prototype a few things that those engines are good at, and you are answering questions about specific features. So maybe in your prototyping process, one group is doing some Twine prototypes and another group is doing some retro game prototypes in 2D before you move into 3D. And if you don't believe that people do that, I encourage you to learn more about Legend of Zelda Breath in the Wild. They made a 2D NES Zelda to prototype Breath of the Wild. So, flowcharts, diagrams and flowcharts may be about diagramming one thing. So maybe a flowchart is about like decision making. There's another type of diagram that I really like called, it's also taken from one of Mark Brown's videos, a boss keys diagram that is, sort of like a way to analyze dungeons. That he uses it for Legend of Zelda and Metroidvania games, but I've used it for like action games too as an analytical tool. But it's a good way to understand lock and key progression. And, but again, it is for lock and key spatial layout. It's not for, you can stretch it pretty far, but like you've got to abstract it a little bit. This is for spatial relationships. It's not for, I'm going to draw my map of my start area. It's like saying when, it's for you to say like, well, when I start my level, I want to be able to see this thing, and this thing, and then have the direct connections be that, and that. So it's long-term spatial planning. And some of you may be thinking, well, that's not important. I don't need to plan that. But do you? I bet you don't think so, but you do. So now let's get into the nitty-gritty. And by nitty-gritty, I mean like still the understanding the soft skills of space, but like, in case you haven't noticed yet, I'm not going to just teach you a software tutorial. I mean, I did. I gave you software tutorials that I prepared for you. But, how do we use it better? So first things first, as a level designer, you got to understand your metrics. What are metrics? So metrics are unit-based measurements of a player avatar and their movements that level designers must plan for. And do I have? Yes, I do. Hoo-hoo. I couldn't remember if I had a certain batch of images on my on this slide deck, but I do, and I'm very excited about it. So let's look at Mario. Let's think about Mario. Mario can jump in Super Mario Bros. 1 from a run. He can jump 10 units or block widths far. That's how far he jumps. So why does this matter? Well, in World 8.1 of Super Mario Brothers, there is a gap where it is 11 units long. Or to get to the other side, you'd have to jump 11 units, basically, in a run. So, a lot of people, when they're playing Super Mario Brothers for the first time, they fail this because they're like, oh, okay, I'm just going to take a running leap. And they go for it, and they fall in the pit because they're just short, because Mario jumps 10, and the thing needs 11 to be cleared. That kind of challenge exists because somebody was thinking about Mario's jumping metrics. So how do you beat it? They put a 1 block wide little stepping stone in the middle, and you've got to bounce off the stepping stone. So you've got to be running at full speed, and then you've got to boing boing across. Why does this matter? Well, metrics are how you create. That's one of the ways you create challenge. You need to understand how does the player move, and how do I create challenge with that? It doesn't have to be jumping. It can be run speed. So if I'm playing Metal Gear Solid and I have the speed of a guard going back and forth versus the speed of Snake, my character, if you've never played Metal Gear Solid, he's Solid Snake, the speed of Snake running from one hiding spot to another, and then the distance from one hiding spot to another. So we've got speed of Snake, speed of guard, distance. All of these factors go into that. That creates interest, that creates drama. That's all based on metrics. That's all based on how the characters move versus the distance that you have to move them. So in Mario games, if a gap is short, it feels very good. If a gap is far, it feels a little more tense. That is how you create challenge. So, what else? Again, if you don't believe me talking about metrics, then maybe believe the developers of God of War. Now, this is something from this is an image from their presentation at GDC a few years ago, when they were talking about all of Kratos' metrics and how they would start to think about how he moves and how to build spaces to match how he moves, so that you could create. I don't have the animated GIF version of this, but you would create these areas where he could leap and move and duck and do these things in certain ways, and it would be appropriately built for Kratos. And then again, when you are, when you're using your metrics, again, this is why gray boxing is so important, because you want to put your character in a scene and just put level geometry around them and make sure that the level geometry fits what you're trying to do with your character and with your level experience. So, if you've ever played Mario Maker, one of the things that happens in Mario Maker, unless you're trying to make Kaizu levels or something like that, which are those levels that are just kind of challenging for the sake of being challenging, you want to think about how much leeway does the player have to get through this gap between the spinny blade and the thwomp, right? How much do I want to put between the player? Are they going to actually have enough time, or does it have to be one specific type of thing? You want to think about how they move, and you also want to think about even beyond that, kind of next level design. Not that this is something that you're necessarily going to do as a new designer, but something that you want to think about in the future when you're a little more advanced, is in the upper right corner here is a map by my friend Andrew Yoder. He designs, to practice his level design, he designs Quake levels. And these playground Quake levels. And one of the things he does is he creates like points of interest, which are the colored circles. But then he also creates like these other points and like mechanisms. So some of them are like really simple, like maybe there's a mover, maybe there's stairs that move you between two of these, color points of interest. But then he also adds expert level pathways. So, maybe there is a rocket jump that's required. So you can go from, 2 to 5 here with a rocket jump if you know how to rocket jump. And likewise, this is the kind of thing that we're putting into our game right now, where we are like, well, you can get from this point to this point with just this one character with their like vanilla abilities. But if you know that you can chain these other two characters together, you can actually get to this farther third point. But that's the kind of stuff that you get into when you understand like movement and mechanisms, is you can start to like think about high level play and so it's like creating basic challenge, but then again, by mastering this, and it's not something that you master it once and you're done. It's like, okay, in this game I need to master it. But if you can like understand this idea of metrics, you can start to eventually think about like, well, how does my game become high level play? How do I kind of like allow my players to maybe break and skip the sequence of play and do things like that. So this is a really powerful skill to understand, even though it seems so basic. A lot of this is in design can be like based on diagramming and drawings, but once you get into actually designing your real level space, there are a few types of drawings that can be very useful that actually do come straight from architecture. One of them is a floor plan, top-down map, and you can really see this probably one-to-one with your current setup. And in fact, if you all saw where did that go? Okay. If you all saw this article I shared the Gamma Sutra version, but this one is bigger pictures. Let's see how long it takes to load. But if you see these, where did I put it? There it is. It'll eventually show up. It's all blurry. So drawing your level spaces in a top-down diagrammatical fashion can be very useful. And the reason for that is that you can start to plan like how things fit together, where your coins are, where your character starts, where your little hazards are. You can think about like build yourself basically a key of marks, and then you can start to like space things out and see what is going to be within each space. That can be very useful. Again, to get yourself going before you just like start slapping stuff together in an engine. But here's the thing: top down isn't really three-dimensional all the time. That's why we have another type of architectural drawing called building section, which is a type of architectural drawing where you slice into a building and you look like from a certain point, and then you like look in. So imagine you've sliced a cup and you're looking at that sliced cup from the side. You'd see the outline of the cup, right? So that's what a section is. It's like you take a section of it and you look at it. Well, why is that useful? Now you start understanding three-dimensional relationships. So what's higher and lower than other things? That can be really useful, again, because if you can diagram to the side as well as top down, then you can start to think in 3 dimensions. And see, there we go. Here's an architectural example of a Frank Lloyd Wright house. You can start to plan out thinking about like, well, people who are inside the house can see out, but people who are outside the house cannot see inside to the private people's, infringing on the people's privacy because of the way we lay out windows versus patios versus other things. Building elevation, we don't really use that. These are all things that you should have learned in our drawing for architecture classes, like these types of drawings, but I want you to know that they are actually still very useful in level design. We don't use elevations a whole lot. The closest thing would be concept art, but we usually do that in perspective. There is a really useful thing called a axonometric drawing, which is a type of 3D architectural drawing where you extrude a drawing from a plan. When you do these, you take a floor plan, you turn it 45 degrees, and then you take your ruler and then draw lines up from it, and then build out the level space or the building space. You don't have to do it to that degree. This isn't an architectural drafting exercise, but I do find these very useful for when I'm building levels. If I'm doing something in 3D, I'll do an axonometric. And if you might be thinking, that's called isometric, you're actually wrong. They're actually called axonometric. Isometric is another type of thing that got confused with this type. It's close. It's not quite there. But this can be useful if you are planning out something in 3 dimensions, because then you get to see it down in plan, but also you understand 3-dimensional relationships. So that's why this is a nice build, a nice type. In case you haven't noticed, I use graph paper a lot with my level design, and the reason for that is twofold. One, I can think in metrics, because let me see if that image ever loaded. Yes, okay, so here's a good example. So this is, these are level sketches from my game Kudzu, which is a GB Studio game. But all of these, for this game, I'm making all my blocks in between the spaces on the graph paper out to be my 16 by 16 ground tiles, and then that lets me understand how many ground tiles are going to be in each room. So it lets me plan out space that way. Same thing with where I put enemies and snakes and bugs and all that other fun stuff. So that's why you plan on this type of paper, is that you can say this is going to be this much gameplay unit, or you can do this handy thing where okay, if I'm drawing an axonometric, I can draw from corner to corner and have it be nice and neat without having to worry about messing with, I realize we're at time real quick. Perspective, it's concept art. Diagrams can be useful. So these are abstracted drawings that start to describe that, you want to give an idea of a spatial element. This is where you just kind of maybe you make a little sketchy drawing and you do an arrow to show oh, it's supposed to be scary when you look down, or, I want these characters to be at an advantage over other characters because they're high up, or things like that. So it's diagramming spatial ideas. So here's 2 diagrams. Here's diagrams of, so this is actually based on a GDC talk from one of the designers from Horizon Zero Dawn. He was talking about how he designed in plan and then thought about it more 3-dimensionally, and how thinking in 3 dimensions, so thinking not only in top-down plan, but also trying to think about what the height-based stuff was, it made a better level. So he actually made this map, quite literally made this map in his first draft of a level, and it was sent back by his boss because he's well, it's a bad level, it's too flat, you need more height variation. So thinking in these different dimensions created more interest. It gives the player more choice. It gives the player ability to get the drop on enemies, or the enemies to have the drop on the player. It creates more spatial interest. There's more uneven relationships between the player and the enemy when you have spatial variation in a level. So you want to add lots of it. Implementation, build it. So you build mechanisms, which are environment objects that players can interact with. When you do that, build yourself a toy box or a sandbox. Basically, it's make sure it all works. We've talked about that. And then you build it. You use your metrics, you build it, you test it, you see if it works. If it doesn't work, you change it. But you test. So you wanna make sure it's possible to beat. This is possible to beat. I got a GIF of Meat Boy getting crushed. But yeah, you tested a bunch and make sure that your mechanisms work. This is also an idea called juicing, which is you have a mechanism. So here's spinning saw blades, right? So those are basic spinning saw blades. They stay and they spin and they hurt you. But one part that comes out of when you are testing is actually this progression where it's okay, I have this one version of something, but what if I made the spinning saw blades be on their own spinning things, so you get double spin, and boy, doesn't that get interesting. You want to, when you are making these mechanisms, you want to look for possibilities for other ways to use something. That's called juicing. You want to juice your mechanisms because then your mechanism has, it's more interesting. If one thing can only be used one way, it might not be good. It might still be there's really... Well, no, there's lots of ways to use spikes and lava and things like that. But if there's only one way to use a thing in a game, it's probably not usable. So you want to at least try to figure out two ways that are interesting to use something. So juicing, finding multiple uses for single mechanisms. Gray boxes, we talked about that. There's gray boxing, do it. Then after that, you make it pretty. So, so let's say I've made my level, I've tried it out, it's good, players love it, but it's not very pretty yet. Well, now that it's good, you can make it pretty. You can dress it up and do different cool things with it, because now you can afford to put in all the environment art. So that's level design. Any last questions? I never got an answer back on what he specifically called it, but spec sheet, planning doc. Insert reasonable name for level design planning thing. But yes, people do plan their levels out before they jump in. Any last questions? No? Alright, well then I will be off. Let me know if you need anything, and I will talk to you later.